Hello, my name's Andy Schmuckler. I want to start with the proposition that the Republican Party of today can be adequately described accurately as a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world worse or to make the human world more broken. And secondarily, uh, uh, to assert that this was not always true about the Republican Party. Up and through up through the into the early 90s, it was not true about the Republican Party. Back then, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, I lean toward the Democratic Party, but there were virtues and faults on both sides. And the Republican Party under, say, George H.W. Bush, who did not do things that consistently made the human world worse. It was a mixed picture, and that had been the case about the Democratic and Republican parties for a very long time. So how did it get to be different? And here's my analysis of it. It goes like this. In the political system of the United States from the end of the Civil War, Lincoln having been the first Republican president, up until the 1960s is when it begins to turn. What we've got are two political parties that are mixtures. Each one is housing one of what I would regard as the top two forces of brokenness in the United States, the American civilization. Answer to the question, what forces are at work here that have the most impact, that degrades the society from it being better, people being in better shape and whatever. And the two that I would have nominated to describe the America of let's say 1870s on to the 1960s, almost a whole century, is a force of white supremacy, which dominated the whole segregated Jim Crow South, and the force of corporate greed, which dominated the Republican Party, was emergent in the post-Civil War era. A party which was able to elect almost all the presidents for a considerable length of time after the Civil War. And the Democratic Party remained the home of the heirs to the slave power. So even up into the time of FDR in the 1930s, his politics have to take in the party have to take into account the strong views of segregationists on issues having to do with white supremacy and the oppression of black people. And then, so in the struggle for power between these two parties, and our system is set up so that I think it sort of will inevitably emerge that there's going to be two parties, but that's another thing. There was a balance of power of sorts that included the fact that each one housed a major force of brokenness, and the two of them, the corporate greed types, trying to get the Republicans into power, and the white supremacist types trying to get their Democratic Party into power, they canceled each other out. So you had two parties that were pretty much mixed in terms of what we call good and evil, but constructive and destructive, various ways of putting it. But they canceled each other out. Then in the 1960s, I don't know, I could write a paper on exactly how it is that the Democratic Party that had been the party of that solid South, the segregationist South, where blacks had been largely disenfranchised, et cetera, how that I don't know how it came to be, but the Democratic Party that controlled Congress, I think, pretty well in the mid 1960s, definitely had the White House. JFK was elected and he was assassinated. LBJ took over as from vice president, was elected in 1964. And then in 1965, the United States passes landmark civil rights legislation. And LBJ signs this. And he apparently says to his people, we're going to lose the South, we, the Democrats, for a generation. So he saw that the solid Democratic South, well, I don't know how much he first saw, but in fact, the solid Democratic South from the at the mid 1960s, before the Civil Rights Acts were signed, became by the early 90s a solid Republican South. So a segregationist like Strom Thurmond, who actually was big presidential candidate for the Dixiecrats back in '48. He was Mr. Segregation. He switched from being a Democrat to being a Republican. Similarly with Trent Lott, who was from Mississippi and was became the Republican leader in the Senate. I believe he was well connected with the segregationist force of the South. So you had two forces of brokenness. That's kind of crucial to the larger point I'm going to want to make, is that we're talking about two different forms of things that make the world worse. White supremacy does it this way, corporate greed does it that way. They had canceled each other out for almost a century when the Democrats hosted white supremacy and the Republicans hosted corporate greed. Then finally, as the South, the Southern segregationists migrated into the Republican Party. We've got two powerful forces of brokenness on the same side. And I actually do believe that was something which set in train a whole sequence of things that contribute to the mess we're in now, actually. The fact that there were two, corporate greed had to coexist with the rest of what made up a conservative America, which includes a lot of decent civic values and things like that. But now the decent part of conservative America is having to contend in their political instrument, the Republican Party. They're having to contend with two powerful forces. And I believe that over time, and it really becomes visible in the 90s. I mean, that's when I was able to see it. But I bet you could probably see it happening before that. I just don't know enough of the history. There's a Powell memo, and I think the Republican strategists have been so ferocious. They must have been really pretty good at understanding how they could take advantage of having a bunch the racist vote. Bolstering their corporate greed vote. I also do believe that the corporate greed vote is more the controlling thing, that they basically utilize to get power the passions of a racist culture that vote. The whites of the South, a substantial number of whom will vote in the direction of keeping the black people in their place. People who are probably really happy to see all what's going on with DEI and all the programs that have been institutionalized both publicly and privately to try to bring black people much more fully into equality in the society. whether they're well designed for that purpose or not, I'm not in a position to judge. But the goal is certainly a laudable one, that we don't want people to be oppressed because they're a member of one race, and apparently is a very difficult thing to overcome once it gets bred into the bone, as it did in America up until the Civil War, the freeing of the slaves, and then finally the Civil Rights Acts and the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus the board that integrated the schools. That's definitely the right direction you want to go if you do believe that all men are created equal, which we say we do, and which I think is a useful belief to have in the ways that count, entitled to their own well-being as much as anybody else. So here we have two forces under the same Republican tent, and one of them, the corporate greed, is able to spend money to get good propagandists and will rope in the racists with whatever appeals they need to have. And that didn't just start. Even Ronald Reagan back in 1980 ran for president, launching his career, the campaign. I think the launch was in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which is a dog whistle, as I understand it. He had the segregationists back, I think was the. So there was a dirty history even back then. And Nixon had his 1968 Southern strategy. So they recognized the opportunity early on. Eventually, the Republican Party had these two things together that were too powerful to be able to withstand the forces of brokenness that allied with each other, as opposed to canceling each other out. These two forces would have something in common enough that it made their alliance very easy. There is something about how brokenness works in the world, so that the people who are operating in a system which generates entities, corporations that are solely motivated by more and more money, they can more readily make common cause with people who are interested in oppression than if you had people who weren't driven by more and more for me, I don't care about the common good, or the people who feel like I got to dominate them and terrorize them and compel them into submission and maintain myself as the superior ones and all that stuff. They're both forms of psychological imbalance, spiritual imbalance, moral imbalance, and they naturally can form an alliance, I believe, more than with their opposites. And there's something about the intensity of brokenness which is a bit difficult for the forces of wholeness to match. I mean, the people who are deeply racist maybe have a deeper passion for the white supremacy than the people who are happy to live in equality and like that. How do you get people more impassioned for just decency? And the people who, so the Republican Party becomes the instrument of an alliance between two things that have a fair amount in common, even though they take different forms. And then you notice also, if you look at, well, what is the source of the power of the Republican Party? How is it that they're able to get all this much power behind brokenness that it becomes a coherent force that consistently works to make things worse. And one of the things that you can see that is part of, also allied with those other two, is a kind of religiosity. It's, well, widely discussed how Donald Trump and his fascists at this point um, have an enormous amount of 85% of people who regard themselves as evangelical Christians. Yeah, if we had asked that question, well, what are the two forces in American civilization that are making things most broken? I think that we also um, could have pointed to a couple of other things that were in American civilization that that would have come in maybe third and fourth in that competition for most powerful forces of brokenness back in previous centuries. One of them is a form of religiosity. Um, the manner in which the people who brought Christianity to these shores regarded their right to spread their religion and stomp out a competing religion. Uh, there's a particular spirit in there too. It is also a spirit of brokenness. The the spreading of American white missionary Christian uh, ethos, or call it, was a significant force of brokenness. You can read some of the ways in which Indian children were compelled to go off to these mission schools and separated from their families and their culture, breaking these people that had already been broken by. And then there's another force that go together, and that's American imperialism. So when I was first putting this together into understanding sort of how a force of brokenness takes various forms and how those forms form good, easy alliances, this was during W's presidency. And I believed that just as Franklin Graham, son of Billy Graham, his crusade thing with the Iraq War represented the worst of American religiosity, a force of brokenness that goes way back. So also, let's see, where was I going? Um, oh, Dick Cheney, I believed at that time, I still kind of think so, that the reason we invaded Iraq was Dick Cheney. The reason Dick Cheney got us to do that was American imperialism. It's another form that the force of brokenness took in America that had the non-trivial effect of making the whole human picture where the American civilization is operating less beautiful than it might have been. Well, like the idea of manifest destiny. Greed combined with a certain kind of religiosity to allow the people to think that God wanted whites to seize California, for example, because these savages don't know how. God wants the most productivity out of the earth, and these savages are occupying this wonderful place. We could get a lot more productivity out of it, and that's what God wants. So, religion, greed and religiosity combined, and you can see that with W and that presidency, however the various individuals contributed to the course it took, Americans acted like an imperialistic power in invading Iraq against the will of our friends, for the most part. The basis of what turned out to be untrue about weapons of mass destruction. So I don't really know why we invaded Iraq, but I think it was. And the thing is that the Republican Party had become a, a party of that was more imperialistic uh, back at that time. Then it seemed like maybe with Trump, that part had been sloughed off. But now here we're back to, oh, Canada should be our 51st state. So he's confused me about how the force of imperialism is or is not driving how this coherent force that's taken over the Republican Party is operating. But he's allying himself with other gangsters. It seems obvious. But why he's threatening Canada, threatening Denmark over Greenland, and threatening to take over the Panama Canal. Is this going back to the end of the 19th century and, when we used the Spanish-American War to gain all these, all these territories to own from Puerto Rico to the Philippines? Where is this Republican Party on this? I don't know. But something surprising has been happening with this newly emboldened Trump becoming president. So what all this suggests is, well, the fact that the Republican Party could be taken over by this force of brokenness because of the shifts in alignment that occurred with the signing of the Civil Rights Act. And then the way that all these different forces of brokenness can make an alliance together. And I haven't, we could also talk about the gun lobby and the NRA and the use of the one party, the one issue voters being exploited by propagandists. And similarly on the issue of abortion, where you could persuade millions of Christians that if you take the right position on abortion, you've covered the bases well to be a good Christian. You don't have to pay attention to how the rich are stealing from the poor, which is something that gets a lot more attention in the Bible than the issue of abortion. All these things can readily ally together. There's been almost like a pulling of a magnet where the things that are into brokenness, male domination, we can also add to the pile. The things that are into brokenness sort of come together because they're drawn, because the polarity, maybe you could put it in terms of destructive and constructive rather than north-south poles, but there's a polarity that makes them all drawn to the same end of things. And then if you can take over the party with all of those elements, and the numbers of good, decent conservatives wanting their party to be a good, decent party, becoming more and more attenuated, it can become transformed from the party of Eisenhower, Reagan, first Bush, Gerald Ford. Decency is being part of it. It can be transformed from that into something which is really consistent in making the human world worse. I used to make little lists of, well, here's a place where the Republicans are playing a constructive role. They're not wholly owned yet by this coherent force, making all of its decisions in the wrong direction. But it's been a while since I could point to anything that was better because the Republicans existed, rather than, in almost every case, worse. a coherent force. Well, it's a coherent force. I mean, it's certainly coherent under the domination of Donald Trump. And since he got into power, as I said earlier, everything he does is making things worse, degrading American education, degrading American media, degrading American capitalism, degrading the world system, degrading the situation in Gaza, degrading the situation in Ukraine, degrading the situation with respect to climate change, degrading the situation having to do with the rule of law in America. Consistent across the board. And he dictates to the whole Republican Party, so we really don't get very many profiles in courage at this point. And then another form of brokenness, which I'm not going to go into in any depth because it's so interesting and there's so much to say about it, which is the form of brokenness that exists in tens of millions of Americans who have been supporting this thing, in spite and who have some combination of have believed things that are so obviously not true. That takes brokenness. Or have supported things which are so obviously the opposite of what they say they value. And that's a kind of brokenness. So there's something gone wrong in the Republican base, which is essential for any of the rest of it to exist. It's sort of the lifeblood. Without the Republican base being the thing it is, really out of touch with reality and kind of crazy in the political realm. Without that base, Donald Trump wouldn't be able to control the Republican Party because he's able to kill off anybody's career just by saying he's the enemy. And the Republican base will drive him out like they drove, what's her name, Liz Cheney out. So there's brokenness in that Republican world. And one of the interesting things is the process which this force of brokenness, which behaves the way what religiously minded people used to call evil, was understood to behave by consistently degrading the world in one way or another. This force of brokenness congealed in one half of America and then was not well perceived or well combated by the other half of America. And so you get a disease that's taking over half the body politic, which creates a situation in which our founders would have wanted to be able to say, had they had the medical perspectives we can talk about now, about an immune system, which they didn't talk about in the 18th century. If the immune system, as this dark thing is working to take over the Republican Party, the immune system should be able to perceive, here's that dark thing. However they wanted to talk about it. They could have just said, this is a lot of fascism involved in Rush Limbaugh and Newt Gingrich and stuff like that. Well, and recognize, okay, well, that thing is rising on the right, and we, the immune system, have got to get our T cells and whatever, bactophages, whatever the words are, how the immune system works, to glom onto this thing and to beat it back to oblivion or kill it off, or however the immune system would deal with this particular kind of fascist infection that has been rising on the right. I'd say probably since 1970, maybe the election of Nixon. I mean, also there's an element of that behind Barry Goldwater. It goes back, but it hadn't taken over the party until this past generation. And it was the responsibility of the Democratic Party and the liberal world to see what was happening, to see that there was a coherent force that was gaining power. And eventually, the failure to combat it, and I think that Obama actually unintentionally helped empower it, helped lead to Trump. The failure to recognize it is the other place where the breakdown of the American system must be seen. The disease arose on the right, but the failure of the immune system on the other side was equally responsible for its ever gaining all this power. It could have been combated in a more decent America with the American public not so crazy as so many people have become, having been subjected to poisonous propaganda for so long against babies